honored to be able to be here and to listen to you all. And our first speaker this afternoon is George Heffernan. He's a professor of philosophy at Merrimack College in Massachusetts, and he has interest in the phenomenological study of evidence, understanding, and meaning, having written extensively on Husserl, Heidegger, Camus, and phenomenology generally. But his current project at the moment is a new edition of Augustine's Against the Academics. So we look forward to hearing from George.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes, good.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, I might turn it up a notch here. I don't want to do anything that will complicate the technology. Yes, it's a big honor for me to be able to speak at this conference, and I want to thank Mette and Ruth and Felix and everyone who's been connected with the organization, which has been excellent. And I am very happy to have heard a number of world-class papers now. I couldn't get up in time for maybe the 3 o'clock in the morning papers from the East Coast of the United States time. But so here I am. I can't pass it off to anyone else, so I'm going to have to actually do some work here. And I have come with some talking points, and they are on the screen, I hope. I'm screen sharing. Can everyone see them? Excellent, good. Okay, so I have a title, of course, Weltanschauung, Weltbild, or Weltauffassung, Stein on the significance of Husserl's way of looking at the world. And there's an abstract, of course, which maybe you've read, maybe you haven't read, but I won't read it because you can read it later. And I even composed a short preface which I entitled Reconstituting the Phenomenology of the Constitution of the Social, because that's what really is at stake here. And I there in that short preface summarize a few of the points that I think Dirk van Vara makes in the introduction to the new Husserliana edition, which I found very helpful. I don't want to criticize, of course, any of the previous volumes of Husserliana. You can't live without them. But, some of the introductions run to 100 pages. And I was very happy to see that this one was very, very concise and precise and got right to the point. I don't know if that's the final form, by the way. We'd have to wait and see. I think you can summarize the preface in basically one sentence. I have the pointer, the cursor pointing at it right now. It's the last paragraph. The present paper stretches the conference horizon by casting a wide temporal and thematic net to pose the question concerning the extent to which Stein and Husserl understood one another's general philosophical phenomenological approaches, in a word, their respective Weltanschauungen, worldviews. Stein, of course, is going to nuance that concept quite a bit, in one of the essays that I'd like to talk about a little bit later on. But basically, you can summarize even that statement of the purpose of the paper by saying that what this is going to boil down to is the question of how Stein and Husserl take a position on what they each call transcendental idealism. This transcendental idealism has been mentioned in at least 2 papers so far that I've been able to attend, and it really is the crux of the philosophical distinctions between the two, and the connection between this transcendental idealism and a phenomenology of the social, it seems to me, is that Husserl is actually trying to develop a phenomenology of the social under the presupposition of transcendental idealism. And Stein is rejecting transcendental idealism, certainly his form of it. And so that's going to have all kinds of implications for how they diverge in their respective phenomenologies of the social. So that's basically a short version of the preface, right? Now the talking points, I somehow would like to stick to the time here. And so I attach great importance to less talk and more on my part and more discussion of the group. And so I have 5 sets of talking points. And so I'm actually going to try to talk for no more than 5 minutes about each one, so that, again, we stick to the time limit here. And the reason for there being so many talking points is because originally I was going to write a paper that would be like 12 pages that you could read very quickly. And then I gave that project up very, very quickly. And then I started collecting talking points. And then more and more talking points had to join the talking points until the point where I just had to say stop. And so that's where I stopped. And so the first set of talking points, you'll see, basically the first set of talking points is right here. Introduction, a question, right? A relationship fraught from the start, and perhaps to the very end. The second group of talking points is an elaboration where I talk about Stein's distance, her distancing herself from and her critique of Husserl's transcendental idealistic worldview. And that's the section where I'll talk about her treatises that her Abhandlungen, Aufsätze that deal specifically with Husserl's phenomenology. Then in the clarification, I'm going to take a turn in the favor of Husserl and lay out why I think that Stein's view of Husserl's Weltanschauung, or she calls it Weltbild, she calls it actually both in the case of Husserl. I think he prefers to call it a Weltauffassung, a kind of world apprehension, right? I'm going to take a turn for in the favor of Husserl and explain why I think that Stein's view of Husserl's view of the world was limited. And I want to pick up a point that Emanuela mentioned yesterday. This is not about blaming anyone. It's not about certainly not criticizing Edith Stein for not having taken into account texts of Husserl that she could not possibly have taken into account at the time. At the very end, when I get through the resolution here, that basically is my thesis, the incompleteness of Stein's understanding of Husserl's phenomenology of the social. When I get to the conclusion, I basically admit what everyone knows already. There was a time, and we know this from Husserl's Briefwechsel, there was a time when Husserl himself found that Husserliana had become overwhelming for Husserl before Husserliana became Husserliana, right? He was drowning in his research manuscripts. And, towards the end of his life, he was basically writing in several cases to correspondence partners that he was writing only for his Nachlass at that point, right? And he just had lost all oversight over the projects that he was working on. So let's go back to the introduction briefly, right? And talk about this relationship that I think was fraught from the start. Because basically, as we all know, Edith Stein came to Göttingen in 1913 in order to study with the author of The Logical Investigations, which she had read, she had studied. Husserl was very impressed at their first encounter. He said something like, "Oh, the whole thing, both volumes?" He was immediately impressed. But of course, there was an element of disappointment or disillusionment here, because Stein quickly found out that the philosopher who was the one whom she would then be studying with was no longer the Husserl of the, well, let's just say more realist logical investigations, but the more idealist philosopher of the ideas for pure phenomenology. That, of course, is ideas one. All right. So, and like many other students of Husserl's, Reinach and Konrad Martius and others, members of the Göttinger Philosophische Gesellschaft, Stein reacted critically, to this turn, a perceived turn on Husserl's part. This turn, of course, is very controversial to this day. In the literature, some people say Husserl never turned away from the realism of the logical investigations. He deepened how to explain it, how to clarify it, right? But many people do not see it that way, and certainly many of his students at the time did not. Right, and that's how you get quotes like talking point 122, where in one of the treatises on Husserl's philosophy, and this is actually, later, it's not 1918. She basically says, "Kein Bewusstsein, keine Welt," no consciousness, no world, and that's not really an accurate quote of what is going on in Ideas One. But at any rate, they engaged in lively discussions and passionate debates about transcendental idealism. Notwithstanding, Stein submits her dissertation, as we know. It's graded with summa cum laude. It's a very happy occasion. There's a wonderful account of it in ESGA 1. It goes on for several pages. But then something interesting happens because Husserl demurs at publishing the dissertation in his Jahrbuch. And according to Stein, the reason that Husserl gives is because he thinks that it anticipates, the word there is vorwegnehmen, okay, einiges, okay, sie haben einiges vorweggenommen aus meinen Ideen zwei, which is going to appear. So there's an interesting connection there between what's going on in zum Problem der Einfühlung on the one hand, and then the new edition of ideas too, and the old one, of course, too, right? So at any rate, long story short, even before her promotion, Stein offers to serve Husserl as his private assistant. He accepts, but they do not cooperate well together. She begins telling people like Fritz Kaufmann that there's no real Zusammenarbeit going on, right? That's talking point 1421. She complains that she's working on manuscripts. She takes them to Husserl. He doesn't look at them. He just generates more new manuscripts, right? And then the famous line that I think has been already cited by at least one speaker, where Stein says, "Gehorchen, das kann ich nicht." Okay, I can serve a cause, eine Sache, but not eine Menschen, right? So she sees herself, I think, as someone who's working on die Sachen selbst, but not as someone who's some sort of gopher or secretary or basically, an Untertan, right? So the plan Zusammenarbeit does not go well. This has something to do with point 143. Husserl's not favoring very much women in the academy. This affects Stein's prospects for habilitation. I think there was a misunderstanding on Husserl's part. This you see, I think, in Husserl's letter of recommendation for Stein in 1919. He seems to still be under the impression that women do not have access to all of the grades, the academic grades that the universities have to offer, although the Prussian decree of 1908 had actually made that clear. It had to be clarified again, and that prompted Stein to write to the Prussian Minister for Culture and Education, and he answered back, of course, you can do this. But Stein never did, she was never able to achieve the habilitation. So for me, it's a question of empathy, right? I mean, my question is, did Stein and Husserl, talking point 1.5, did Stein and Husserl ever genuinely understand one another philosophically? And I think this goes to the heart of their respective understandings of the general relationship between mind and world, hence the connection to transcendental idealism. But of course, it also concerns their respective understandings of particular relationships in the phenomenology of the social, right? And here, the whole complex of problems arise both in ideas too, whichever version you're working with, and in on the problem of empathy. And one of my favorite passages, by the way, from ESGA 5, Problem of Empathy, is page 107, where Stein very clearly talks about empathy as not just a two-way street, but a two-way street in which others can not only understand us, but they can understand us in some cases better than we understand ourselves, right? They can actually correct us, right? This is a fascinating idea when you think about it, right? If you start talking about whether people's perceptions of and judgments about their own happiness states are like infallible and incorrigible, right? This is a hot topic in the literature on happiness studies right now. And Stein almost just in one paragraph, she says, of course, that happens all the time, right? And so this is very interesting because what you get between Stein and Husserl is for several years now, attempts on the part of the respective other to correct the other with respect to their understanding of issues related to transcendental idealism, okay? Anyway, in the elaboration then, things get complicated quickly. Stein's distance from and critique of Husserl's transcendental idealistic worldview. Her career path takes her in a different direction, right? After she leaves Husserl in 1918. She really is only, as we know, Husserl's private assistant from something like October 1916 until February 1918. She goes off to teach at the Lyceum of Dominicans. She also at Inspire. She then goes to the German Institute for Scientific Pedagogy in Münster, loses that job because of the anti-Semitic discrimination laws. Then joins the Carmel. There is sporadic contact between them, though in the years after 1918, but just not much, okay? There are even maybe one or two personal contacts, personal encounters. One where she confesses to Husserl how far her way has deviated from his. And then, of course, the Festschrift fire for Husserl in 1929. And then the remark in one of the treatises, from the mid-20s, where she says, I simply haven't spoken to him in several years, so I really don't know, his views at present on transcendental idealism, right? But at any rate, there's something more substantive afoot here, because Stein, talking point 2.2, she undergoes not only a religious conversion, right, in 1922, but also a philosophical conversion in the 1920s and 30s. As she's continuing to struggle with Husserl's transcendental idealism, she begins to translate Aquinas's Questiones Disputate de Veritate, started in 1925, according at least to one or two references in her correspondence, and published in 1931-32. Basically, she gradually comes to prefer Thomistic realism over Husserlian idealism as a way of looking at the world. And this shift is documented in detail in her correspondence with Ingarten. Ingarten, of course, belonged also to those students of Husserl who had broken with him over his transcendental idealism. And of course, we know that Stein and Ingarten had a very close relationship. We won't go into that any further right now. But anyway, point 2.3, right, her reorientation away from Husserl and toward Aquinas, that's reflected in her writings on phenomenology. So you can go to the articles and treatises. Most of them are quite short. I count 6 of them. 2.31, so what is phenomenology from 1924, then Husserl's Phenomenology and the Philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, the significance of phenomenology for a worldview, and then Husserl's Transcendental Phenomenology, and then this excursus on transcendental idealism, which is from Potency and Act, and then the contributions to the Journal of the Thomist Society. And it's striking that number one, as far as the topic of the conference goes, in virtually all of these writings, Stein gives you a kind of boilerplate summary of what Husserl's phenomenology is about. And that's the one point. The other point is that she says virtually nothing about his or even her phenomenology of the social. And then the third point, of course, is the one that I really want to bring in here, and that is that she is, fixated is the wrong word, but let's just say that everything turns around and turns on her criticism of Husserl's phenomenology as transcendental idealism, okay? And in this regard, so that's basically what's common to all of these 6 texts, okay? But the one I want to zero in on briefly here is 233, the significance of phenomenology for a worldview. Das ist auf Deutsch dann die weltanschauliche Bedeutung der Phänomenologie. So it's kind of hard to translate, weltanschaulich in English as an adjective, but, you kind of do your best. And so, but her point in this paper is that it's not just that phenomenology is influential in the formation of people's worldviews, and it's certainly important, critical in the reflection on the worldviews that they have. We know that from from Dilthey's work, Jasper's work, and Husserl's own philosophy as rigorous science. But she turns it around, and she says that what happens is that phenomenologists are human beings too. And from an anthropological perspective, they have a way of looking at the world that they with them to their philosophizing. And she says that this is particularly the case when it comes to Husserl. She actually singles him out. The phenomenologists that she talks about in that piece from 1930-31 are Husserl, Heidegger, and Scheler. And this is where she makes this, I think, marvelous distinction between what she calls a Weltbild, which she characterizes, and this is, of course, the short version that you can put in the talking points. The short version is it's a closed picture of the world that someone has. So it's not open, okay? But she says Husserl has this, right? But she also says that Husserl has a Weltanschauung, a kind of certain manner of looking at the world in a looser sense, right? Husserl's got both. Not everybody has both, but Husserl has both. And at the end, at the beginning and at the end, she's juxtaposing the religious worldview and the scientific worldview and the Catholic worldview and the modern worldview. And basically, and this is, I think, the hammer for a lot of people, she in this connection that Husserl's Weltbild, this closed picture of the world, cannot accommodate, not only does not, it cannot accommodate God, religion, metaphysics, ethics, etc., right? And she's more generous when it comes to the evaluation of what she calls the Weltbilder of Scheler and of Heidegger. Scheler is, of course, more religious for her, and objectively speaking, and Heidegger, well, she basically doesn't want to take a position on Heidegger yet, because Scheler by that point is dead. I think he died in 1928. Heidegger is just getting going, all right, about that time. So at any rate, you get the picture then. If you skip down now, we do, to point 2.4, right? So the Leitfaden, I call it the clue, right? The general thread, right, of Stein's critique of Husserl's phenomenology is going to be her rejection of his transcendental idealism, right? And so, for Husserl, this is, again, boilerplate Husserlian phenomenology. Consciousness constitutes being. Das Bewusstsein konstituiert das Sein. I think we're going to have to nuance that in the discussion, because, that's a very active way of putting the verbing there, right? That sounds like Sein doesn't really do anything, and it's just constituted by Bewusstsein. And I think that you'll find in many Husserlian texts the Medial sense of konstituieren used. Sich konstituieren. Das heißt, in many cases, Husserl simply says, das Sein konstituiert sich im Bewusstsein, or für das Bewusstsein. And that really, I think makes it more of a kind of I don't know how to say it, right? We'll talk about that later. I just want to say that what happens usually when Stein talks about this problematic is that she attributes to Husserl's talk about the relationship between Bewusstsein and Sein, she attributes the more activist, from the standpoint of consciousness, the more activist verb to the situation, and that's not always justified. So she has one reading of it, and it dominates, right? But of course, for her, as I say, 2.2, for her, and this is early 1930s. She's basically opting for Thomas. Knowing intellect, right? The intellectus it does not measure, but is measured by the res, by things known. And for her, this becomes an alternative way of looking at the world, right? And she thinks it's superior to the Husserlian way because it's religious, it's not merely scientific. Usually she characterizes Husserl's way of looking at the world as modernist and scientific. And I think she also, this is not one of the talk points, but it strikes me that she's right insofar as Husserl does seem to have a weakness when it comes to knowledge of and appreciation of the Middle Ages and of the Middle Ages philosophy and of medieval spirituality, right? But back to the talking points, 2.4.4, finally for Stein, Husserl's idealism is, and this is where I think this would really upset Husserl, this way of phrasing the problem. She says it's a personal metaphysical basic conviction. Says it is not an unobjectionable result of phenomenological research. I think that it's not even really a result of phenomenological research at all. It just can't stand scrutiny, right? And she says even it's not decidable by way of philosophy. She writes at one point to Ingarden that, Husserl this is the way he sees things, and his mind is closed. It's this closed picture of the world. and try as much as you can, you're not going to get through to him. And then, of course, there's this wonderful letter of Husserl to Stein from, 17th of July, 1931, where Husserl basically tells Stein, I don't believe any longer that you're going to be able to overcome what he calls das große Hindernis. And das große Hindernis is Transzendental Idealismus. And since she can't overcome that, she can't accept it, she's not going to be able to appreciate how transcendental phenomenology can be a universal study of all phenomena, all. Okay, meaning all, meaning God, meaning the traditional topics of metaphysics, freedom, immortality, all of the usual suspects that Husserl lines up when he talks about die metaphysischen Fragen. Okay, so at any rate, Stein has a great formulation of how they've come to loggerheads about this, because at one point she writes to Ingarten about a year later that, and I've characterized it by putting in quotes, single quotation marks. She basically says, Husserl now thinks that to understand transcendental idealism is to accept it. So if you haven't accepted it, you haven't understood it. And of course, that's really not, a fair hermeneutical approach to take, right? To say to the other party that, if you only understood me, you'd accept me. So you don't accept me, and that's only because you don't understand me. And well, maybe I reject transcendental idealism because I understand it. Is that conceivable? Not for Husserl, okay. But anyway, so she found his way of arguing, not only his position, but his argument profoundly unsatisfactory. Now time is diminishing, so I'm going to go really quickly to the clarification. This is where I kind of talk about how I think that Stein's, what else is there in Husserl other than, what you get with the boilerplate transcendental phenomenological, method and intuition and evidence and this, that, and the other thing, right? Well, I mean, look at the limit problems of phenomenology, Husserliana 42. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not criticizing Stein for not having taken anything into account that she could not possibly have taken into account. But it is striking that many of these manuscripts in 42, most of them were generated, right, while Edith Stein was either still active or still alive, okay? So they're there, right? She wouldn't have had any contact with most of them. But Husserl develops a metaphysics, a monadology, a theory of intersubjectivity, a meta-ethics, okay? He has a teleological way of looking at the world, right? He even has a philosophical theology. He has what I would call, and I think what fairly could be called nowadays, an entire account of mindfulness, Besinnlichkeit. In other words, not strictly speaking than doing phenomenology as a rigorous science, but thinking about life, the world, the meaning of life, the meaning of the world, the sense of the world, and everything that goes into it from a phenomenologically founded and grounded standpoint, okay? And that, he calls this Besinnung. He uses the word Besinnung and besinnliche Evidenz countless times in the manuscripts in 42. And this is not a way of talking that you're going to find in Husserl, say, in the logical investigations or in the ideas. It actually comes in his reflections on toward the end of the First World War. Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit more quickly, right? So he develops actually talking point 3.3, a transcendentally phenomenologically founded metaphysics. Those are his words. Okay, and there's massive evidence in his correspondence for Husserl's openness to metaphysics. I mean, he even at one point, in the opening pages of Ideas 1, characterizes phenomenology as a first philosophy that is there to serve as a prolegomena to any future metaphysics that will dare to come forth as a science. He talks in very Kantian terms about that, and I think very deliberately. Okay, I think that's on page 7 of the redone edition, the 1976 edition of Ideas 1, so Husserliana 3.1, right? He's also got an ethics, a meta-ethics that is embedded in his metaphysics, right? You see that all over the place, right? Not only in the reflections on ethics from the Freiburg years, right, from Husserliana 42, 165 to 527. And he's also got an unpublished and bizarrely unsystematic philosophical theology as well. That's talking point 3.5. That's fascinating. When you just, as a sampling, when you see him talk about my atheological philosophizing, which is very deliberate on his part, right? He mentions God virtually not at all in Ideas 1 or in Formal and Transcendental Logic. It's about bracketing God out, or talking about you're not committing blasphemy if you think that consciousness constitutes God too, right? He talks about, even says, genuine philosophy is eo ipso theology. Right now, of course, I've taken these quotes out of context. If I've double quoted, that means that's basically what's there without the ellipses, right? And then philosophy, says 3.5.11, is, so to speak, my atheistic way to God, right? This is, this is kind of, it's already been talked about in one or two earlier papers. The difference between Stein's Catholic spirituality and Husserl's kind of more restrained Protestant Christianity, right? And I think you see that very much in evidence here. So the resolution is the incompleteness, I think, of Stein's understanding of Husserl's phenomenology of the social. I think that Husserl didn't do us or her any favors in this regard. He doubles down on transcendental idealism as he moves forward. Stein had to know, for instance, just to pick 1.414, she reviewed Cartesian meditations at one point in 1931. And Husserl warns you there not to separate transcendental idealism, because he says if you try to do that, you've not understood either the one or the other. And that, of course, is immediately before his attempt to handle transcendental intersubjectivity in the fifth Cartesian meditations. The conclusion now, so there's a lot here, like for the discussion afterwards, but the conclusion is, just sketching out a broader horizon and arguing for the need for an empathic reading of two already vulnerable authors. The question 511 under philosophical considerations, is this a simple clash of personal worldviews, or a more complicated case of philosophical positions, right? Is there something deeper there than Stein is making it out to be in that worldview paper? The bottom line is 515, Stein is actually seeking a solution to the problem of phenomenological constitution without lapsing, as she finds it, lapsing into transcendental idealism. And of course, for Husserl, this is impossible. You can't, for him, you can't possibly account for any phenomenological concept of constitution without doing transcendental idealism. And then these are the passages in 5.2, the hermeneutical considerations, 5.2.4, 5.2.3, right? Husserl himself was already being overwhelmed by Husserliana before it became Husserliana under that name. These quotes from his letters where he talks about how he's basically just lost control of his productivity. It's a wonderful thing, but and we enjoy tracing all this stuff. But I think for him, it wasn't, all that much fun many times. But it was just as frustrating for him as for people trying to keep up with him. And then 5.4, right? I just want to make this point, 541. There are other Husserl. Right? There is the social Husserl. There's the ethical Husserl. There is even the theological and teleological Husserl. And of course, there is the existential and metaphysical Husserl. But I don't think there's any Husserl comparable to the spiritual Stein in the precise sense, the kind of Edith Stein that you'd be reading in ESGA, 17 through 20, Kreuzes Wissenschaft or Geistige Texte or Wege zur Gotteskenntnis or anything like that. So I'll let it go at that. There's a lot there. I think, I've just basically made the case that there's a lot there, but we knew that already. And so thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.